Good morning, everyone. My name is Hannah.
Good morning.
I'm the Violence Prevention Educator at the Victim Service Center of Central Florida. And today I'm here to share with you how to improve a law enforcement response to sexual assaults for all survivors. And then I'll also be sharing with you more about the Victim Service Center, what we do, just so you can know what our resources are. And if you do come in contact with someone who has been sexually assaulted, you know who you can refer them to. So I want to start off today by sharing with you all a story. In 1973, a beautiful African-American Asian girl by the name of Tarana Burke was born. Although Tarana grew up in a low-income housing project in the Bronx, where crime was extremely prevalent, Tarana grew up a very happy and joyful girl. However, all it took was one traumatic experience to happen that changed her world forever. At the age of 7, Tarana was raped by an 18-year-old man. And scared that her stepfather would hurt the perpetrator, she never told her parents anything. For years, she pushed her pain away, swallowed her anguish, and buried the part of herself she knew that she would never get back. 17 years later, at the age of 24, Tarana met a 13-year-old girl named Heaven, who confided in her and shared her own story of child sexual abuse that she had with her mother's boyfriend. As Tarana listened to Heaven, her heart filled with sadness as memories of her own rape came rushing into her mind. Tarana wanted to tell Heaven if her voice and her story matters, but she couldn't because she neglected her own healing process. As she tells the New York Times, I didn't have a response or a way to help her at that moment. And I couldn't even say me too because I neglected my own pain and healing process. Recognizing the importance of creating a safe space for survivors of trauma, Tarana started the Me Too movement, which was in 2006, and the intent was to raise awareness of sexual violence and provide the necessary tools, courage, and leadership to survivors. So since 2006, millions of survivors of sexual assault, of trauma in general, have shared their stories using the hashtag #MeToo. Now the reason why I'm sharing with you this story is because, as you all know, sexual assault does not discriminate. It can happen to anyone. And these statistics show that among girls and women, females ages 16 to 19 are 4 times more likely to be victims of rape, attempted rape, or sexual assault, and 1 in 6 American women has been the victim of an attempted or completed rape in her lifetime. When it comes to boys and men, 1 in 10 rape victims are men, and 1 in 33 men have experienced an attempted or completed rape in his lifetime. And when it comes to the LGBTQ+ community and people of color, these individuals face the most alarming rates of sexual violence. So while women have a 1 in 6 rate, men have a 1 in 33 rate, the transgender community has almost a 1 in 2 rate. And I do want to say that the numbers that you see on this slide right now are only estimated numbers. Sexual assault is the #1 underconvicted and underreported crime in the United States. So chances are these numbers are much higher. Okay, so as a law enforcement official, you are more likely than not the very first person or persons to come in contact with a sexual assault victim. And this is why it is so important for you to be trauma-informed and understand how you can combat your culture. So the first thing that I want to do today is define what sexual assault is, and I know you all know this, but I just want to set the foundation. So sexual assault is any type of forced or coerced sexual contact or behavior that happens without consent. And within sexual assault lies different types of sexual violence. So there's unwanted touching or fondling, there's child sexual abuse, there's attempted rape, and then there's rape. Now within sexual assault lies rape culture. So like I previously mentioned, rape does not discriminate. It can happen to anyone, anywhere, and at any time. It doesn't matter what your socioeconomic class is, what your race is, your ethnicity, it can happen to anyone. And rape culture is an environment where rape is prevalent and sexual violence is normalized and excused, which is every environment. So within rape culture includes the glamorization of sexual violence that we see in TV shows, in music lyrics, in movies. It also includes the objectification of people. So for example, when a female objectifies a male based on what his body looks like, how big his muscles are, that is a woman objectifying a male, turning him into a sexual object for the female gaze. It's also very similar when a man or a male rates and judges a woman based on the size of her breast or her butt, turning her into a sexual object for the male gaze. It also includes the use of misogynistic language. So there are certain characteristics that a male and a man can show, whereas when a female does it, it seems out of the ordinary, it seems annoying and bossy. So for example, when a man is assertive, when he is in control, when he knows what he's doing, we see this person as someone that we want to vote for. We see him as someone who is respectful. However, when a woman exerts her boundaries, she's assertive, we see her as bossy, we see her as demanding, and this is someone that we question her authority. Now within rape culture, it includes victim blaming. If there's one thing that you get out of this training today, it is victim blaming. And essentially, victim blaming is blaming the victim for their sexual assault, for their rape, and for their trauma. And I'll also share with you a story that recently happened, and this is a true story, and it shows what victim blaming is. So a couple months ago, there was a young woman by the name of Liza Fletcher who went on a run in Tennessee at 4:30 a.m. While she was on that run, she was kidnapped, she was raped. There are some stories that says, or some sources that says that she wasn't raped, there are some sources that says she wasn't raped, but let's just say she was raped. And then she was killed. And what was happening in society, what was happening on the news channel, what was happening in my friend groups, was that instead of blaming the perpetrator for raping her and killing her, what was happening is that these people were blaming Liza. They were asking, why would she go on a run at 4:30 a.m.? Doesn't she know she has kids? Why was she wearing that? And what they weren't doing was what they weren't asking, why did that perpetrator feel the need to do that? Why did he feel the need to rape her? What was wrong with him? And these questions are what we call victim blaming questions. And we didn't take into account that Liza Fletcher was a full-time teacher and full-time mom. And the only time that she had to practice self-care to go on a run was at 4:30 a.m. And victim blaming happens all the time in our society today, and it starts with the why questions. So I'll show you a little more later on about an example about victim blaming and how a law enforcement official's perspective. But essentially, we know that victim blaming is the problem. We shouldn't be asking the why questions. But why shouldn't we be asking why questions? Where does this stem from? And this stems from gender bias. I do want to say that we all have biases. We're all human. That's just how it is. Our perspectives, our perceptions have been influenced by our society, our environment, our parents, our grandparents. And gender bias includes stereotypes about gender roles. So for example, when you see a male automatically assuming that he's aggressive, that he's sexually dominant and sexually aggressive. Whereas when you see a female, she's sexually passive and submissive. Gender bias also includes stereotypes about people or communities based on race, gender-based violence, and particular crime victims. So for example, when you hear about a school shooting, you automatically assume that it's a white male. When you hear about a crime or a murder, automatically assuming that it's a black male. And when you hear about any type of drug deal, automatically assuming that it's a Hispanic or Latinx person. And these biases are just some of the many biases that exist in our society today. And the reason why it's so important for you to be aware of what your biases are is because they can affect the law enforcement officials' perceptions of sexual assault incidents and prevent them from effectively handling reports of these crimes. And I'm going to share with you 2 case scenarios. So a tall black man in good physical condition and with no visible injuries goes to the local police precinct and reports that his boyfriend, with whom he lives, has been sending him threatening texts and voice messages over the past several weeks. The man further reports that his boyfriend assaulted him the night before. The responding officer looks at the man skeptically and tells him that he's not sure that he can take a report based on this information. The officer tells the man to think carefully about whether he has a crime to report and to come back another day if he still believes he needs assistance. What's the most obvious bias that this law enforcement official has?
Guy can protect himself.
Yes, that's a great one.
Guy on guys.
Can you say it again, I'm sorry?
That it's guy on guy, I think it's.
Yeah, but he's gay. And a very common bias in our society is that gay men are hypersexualized. So this law enforcement official probably thought, well, he was probably just asking for it. And this is what prevented him from effectively handling and taking reports of those crimes, of that crime. Another case scenario, and this ties right back into victim blaming, so you'll see the correlation, is that a young white woman enters a police station and reports that 2 weeks earlier she was raped at a house party by a colleague from work. The woman reports that she and the person who she says raped her had been drinking that evening. The police officer on duty asks how often the woman drinks excessively at house parties and what she was wearing that night. The officer then tells her that she should really watch how much alcohol she consumes when she goes out at night, especially if she is getting dressed up. So the officer, I understand that as law enforcement, you have to ask protocol questions. And I'm not telling you not to do your job because you have to do your job. But what this is saying is that the why questions, why were you wearing that? Why were you drinking so much? Why were you out so late? What this does is it infers blame and it makes the victim feel like it's their fault. And at the Victim Service Center, I'll explain later on about who we are, we're the Certified Rape Crisis Center. And we did an internal research study, and we found that victims wait 8 to 10 years before they actually come forward and share their story. So it makes you wonder, why is it? Why are they waiting 8 to 10 years before they're coming forward and telling their rape story? Well, maybe it's because of victim blaming, the why questions, how society has conditioned itself to automatically blame the victim instead of the perpetrator. But what does victim blaming stem from? Gender bias. And we all, like I said, we all have biases, and it's important that we're aware of what those biases are so we don't let it get in the way of how we effectively handle a report. Within rape culture also includes the tolerance of sexual harassment. And I can say I was a server for 5 years, and there were many times where people would come in, they would make suggestive comments that were really disturbing. And I can remember one incident when I was 18 years old. There was this older man who came in, and he specifically requested a pretty server. I unfortunately was up next on the serving station, like that's how we do it. And when he saw me, he was probably like 60 years old. He was like, I want me a pretty little wife like you. I was so disgusted by that. I went in the back, I told the other servers, and they were like, girl, that happens all the time. Just get your money, flirt with him, and just keep it moving. But it just shows how tolerating or how much tolerance we have towards suggestive comments like that in society today. Trivializing sexual assault. So basically saying that sexual assault happens, it's a part of life. Then there's also other common stereotypes like boys will be boys, locker room banter. These further normalize sexual assault in our society today. Like I mentioned, there's gender roles, stereotypes, defining masculinity as dominant and sexually aggressive, teaching women to avoid getting raped as opposed to teaching our youth the importance of boundaries and consent and respecting those boundaries. Refusing to take rape accusations seriously, assuming only promiscuous women get raped, and defining femininity as submissive and sexually passive. So now that we have a better idea of what rape culture is, the question now is how can we combat rape culture? And the first thing that we can do is prevent gender bias in policing. As a law enforcement official, it's important that you gather evidence in an unbiased manner. It's important that you focus on the facts, focus on what's present. Ask the questions that you need to ask, but try not to infer blame. Try not to ask, well, why were you there? Why were you doing that? Biases should also not prevent detectives from conducting a full investigation of all complaints received. Holds abusers accountable. Unfortunately, as our criminal justice system doesn't do this as well as it should be. Out of every 1,000 rapes that occur, only 310 are reported. Out of those 310, only 46 lead to an arrest. And out of those 46, only 5 are convicted. So out of every 1,000 rapes that happen, only 5 perpetrators are being held accountable. And I actually wrote some notes down about, because you're going to hear from Tracy later, but she inspired me to do some research. And I want to share with you some laws that I thought were very interesting. So in the state of Florida, we have statutes of limitations. And the statute of limitations for statutory rape in the state of Florida is 3 years. So what this means is that the victim who was sexually assaulted must bring forth and file any rape charges within 3 years after the commission of the offense to be legally binding and valid for prosecution. So imagine that. Victims are already waiting 8 to 10 years before they come forward. And now when they feel empowered to come forward, they can't even take that to court because the statute of limitations prevents that from happening. I also want to say that when it comes to Native Americans, because they have their own tribal court and because they have their own tribal law, they're self-governing. So if a Native American woman was raped by a non-Native American person, then she could not take that to tribal court because that person is not Native American. So it basically says that a Native American woman can get raped and there will be no consequences. And that's once again why numbers are so high when it comes to that community and that population. We can also speak out if someone is making an offensive joke or trivializing rape, and I know this can be very hard to do, especially if that person is a family member, a loved one, a colleague. But the thing is, even standing in this room right now, I don't know who has been a survivor or who is a survivor of a child sexual abuse or even a rape. And it's important that if you do hear something, if you do notice that what this person is saying is not right, to speak out and to show support, because you don't know who you can be supporting in this room or in any room. Avoid using language that objectifies or degrades someone. Resist slut-shaming and victim blaming. Intervene to help others, which you all do every day, so thank you so much for your service. Learn the meaning of consent and let survivors know it's not their fault. And I want to continue to reiterate this because blame should always go back on who it belongs to, and that is the perpetrator, never the victim. So what happens after a sexual assault? What you see on this slide are what we call impacts and common reactions that we've seen in our clients who have survived a sexual assault, and they differ, they range. I do want to say that another common stereotype in society is that when someone has been raped, you automatically assume they're going to be crying hysterically, their emotions are going to be so clouded, and they're not going to know. They can't really talk or express themselves. But the truth is, we all have different response systems because our bodies react to stress very differently. And I'm going to share with you an example just to paint a picture, and this is not extreme in any case. So for me, let's say I was talking to Tracy and we were having a really heated discussion and I felt like Tracy was targeting me, like she was attacking my character, like she was just saying mean things about me. What happens to me is that I freeze in those situations. Like I stand there, I don't say anything, my brain shuts down, like I physically can't talk. You may be someone who can continue having that conversation, or you may be someone who's like, I need to get away from here. Your flight instincts come in. And you're like, okay, I need to leave, I can't talk to you right now. You may be someone who gets visibly angry and agitated, and your first instinct is, I want to fight somebody. And that's how fights happen. And there's also fawn. So fawn is something that's not often talked about. But essentially, fawn happens and occurs primarily in people who grew up in abusive families or situations. And it's basically when somebody complies and says, yes, like, it's okay. Because in their mind, like when it comes to a sexual assault or a rape, if they don't want to have sex with this person, but their mind and their body is acting counterintuitively, and it's like, just say yes, just get it over with, because you don't want to get hurt. And that's what fawn is. And that happens a lot of the time in a lot of situations. And once again, it's so hard to prove this in court because it's based on speculation. But it's important that when we are talking about sex, not only is it important to hear that verbal affirmative, like, yes, I want to do this, but also look at body language. If someone is like rigid and they don't seem like they're enjoying it, it's important to stop because maybe they're in a state of fawn. Okay, so what can you do as a law enforcement official moving forward? So what we, at the Victim Service Center, we promote the Start by Believing approach. And this emphasizes the importance of responding to a sexual assault as you would any other crime. If someone's car was stolen, you wouldn't question them. You wouldn't say, well, why? Why did you park it here? Or are you sure it was stolen? You would believe them. You would help them. And it's important that you know that trauma-informed care means that prevention and intervention efforts related to sexual assault begin with the stance of the belief that sexual assault is a reality in our communities and validates the experiences of women, men, and the LGBTQ+ community. So when you are in a situation where you're dealing with a sexual assault or even a domestic violence victim, instead of asking, what did you think would happen when? Try and say, did you feel safe around them? Instead of asking, why would you go alone with them if? Try and say, could you tell me more about X, Y, and Z? Instead of saying, are you sure that's what happened? Say, if you're comfortable, could you share what happened? Please take your time. And instead of saying, automatically, you need to go to the Victim Service Center, try and say, here are some options. What would you like to do and how can I help? I do want to say that sexual assault survivors, they probably don't want, most likely they don't want to take their case to court because they know of the statistics. They know that out of every 1,000 rapes, only 5 are actually convicted. They know their chances of actually winning that case. So more often than not, they don't want to take it to court. And I know it can be confusing, but in their minds, and Tracy will share this later on, it's like, I know nothing is gonna happen.